New Zealand. So with that, please welcome our first speaker, John Roberts, who's the Group Manager of Archives Management, and he'll talk about the benefits of managing over 25-year-old records.
Thank you, Natalie. When I first accepted this presentation, I was told that I was to talk a little bit about what the Public Records Act says about 25-year-old records. And of course, one of the reasons for doing something special with your older material, your legacy material, is because there are some provisions in the PRA that apply particularly to material over 25 years of age. But that shouldn't be the reason that you're responding and dealing with managing your legacy records. The key reason that we'd like to leave you all with today is it actually makes good sense for your agencies to be thinking slightly differently about material as it gets older. So in this presentation, we will be talking a bit about what the Public Records Act says, but also what it doesn't say. We're aware that even now, 3 years after enactment, there's still quite a lot of myths and misunderstandings abroad about what the Public Records Act really means. This audience is probably better informed than most, but it doesn't hurt to actually talk about those myths and think about what the Public Records Act really says about dealing with your legacy records, your older material. And why it says that. What are the business drivers that underpin it? Because as I say, this is really about good practice, not about trying to comply with the Act just because it's in force. So we'll be talking a bit about what the considerations are when managing 25-year-old records and the benefits of actively managing those, being aware of them, being aware of how the risks and the circumstances change as material gets older, and what you can and can't do with them. Now, why are we putting particular attention on this? Well, obviously we monitor the situation through our record-keeping surveys, and this is some of the information that we've been hearing. That there's an increasing number of agencies that hold material that's over 25 years of age, from 56% in the 2007 survey to 63% now. So most agencies have actually got material that is in this legacy category, that is older, that needs managing in a different way, where different statutory provisions apply. And perhaps an even more striking increase, I suspect it's actually more a striking increase in awareness of the issue rather than actually that this many people have suddenly got material that's gone from being 24 and a half years old to 25 years old. But the reports are saying that from 11% of public officers with 25-year-old electronic records, now 58% have. So that's nearly 2/3 of the agencies out there have got electronic records more than 25 years of age. Think back to the sort of electronic records that were being generated 25 years ago. That's, 1983? Very different world. So you can understand why those records need active management if they're to be of any use today. And in terms of 25-year-old paper records, around 3/4 of agencies have got that sort of material. So that's a very, very prevalent situation. So if you're here because you've got that material, then don't feel alone. Most of your colleagues are in the same situation. And hopefully today we'll run you through a little bit of the issues around why you need to be addressing them, what you need to be doing, and my colleague Tom Norcliffe, who's speaking second, will be talking in some more detail about what sort of program we're putting in place to work with you all in understanding the issues, understanding the records you've got, and what needs to be done about them. So let's look a little bit at some of the myths that are out there in terms of the Public Records Act. Firstly, public record equals public access. Amazing the number of people who shy away from sort of thinking of records as public records, shy away from dealing with them appropriately because they have some sort of assumption that if they start to consider records as public records, start to deal with them in accordance with the Public Records Act, that there will be public access sort of as a matter of course. Now, that's not the case. But there are some very particular provisions in the Act that apply to older material, to records 25 years of age. And this is what the PRA says. Firstly, it's about determining access, making some active consideration of what access regime should apply to older material. For public officers, when public records have been in existence for 25 years or are about to be transferred to the control of the Chief Archivist, the Public Office must classify the records as either open access or as restricted access records. That's section 43 of the Act. For local authorities, when a local authority record becomes a local authority archive, and remember that happens automatically at 25 years of age, so again that age threshold, the administrative head must classify it as either an open access or a restricted access record. One of the key things to remember there is that happens whether or not the material is transferred to archives custody. If you've got material that is 25 years of age, then those provisions apply. The presumption being there that when material gets older, the sensitivities will die down and there needs to be some active consideration as to what sort of access regime should apply to the material. It shouldn't wait until the material comes to archives before that change in access status can occur. In determining open access or restricted access status, there are guidelines given in the Act around what can be considered. So you have to determine whether there are good reasons to restrict public access to the records, having regard to relevant standards or advice, whether there's any other statutes or enactments in place that require the records to be withheld, and need to specify what sort of period would be involved, notifiers, and from Archives New Zealand perspective, we need to make that information available on a public access register. So there's a real driver in these provisions around transparency, making it known to the world at large what access is available to older material. If you're hanging on to records and they are open access, there comes with it an obligation to provide access. An open access record must be made available for inspection by members of the public free of charge as soon as is reasonably practical after the request to inspect the record is made. Now, these provisions around access were new in the Public Records Act. It was a change from the old Archives Act regime where the access determination only happened at time of transfer. So are people actually doing this? Well, increasingly yes, but still not enough of us. What we know from our surveys is that there is an increase in the number of public officers that have classified them, up from 36% to 41%. And in terms of that provision of free access, 35%, around a third of you providing access to the older records free of charge. Now, obviously this is a matter of concern because these provisions are in the Act for good reason. So it's important to us to work with you all to try and increase the level of compliance, increase the level of awareness of the obligations, to classify older material, to provide access where appropriate, and to be thinking through in a very conscious way what sensitivity still exists with older material that's in your care. So what sort of advice do we offer? Well, first, the key thing is to determine if your agency actually holds any records that are 25 years of age. If you don't know what you've got, you don't know to what these obligations apply. So a fundamental precondition of operating these provisions effectively, of providing appropriate levels of access to legacy material, is to know what you've got. And to know that at a level of precision. So if there aren't any controlling lists, registers, indexes, or other sort of tools for getting detailed access to material, create some. As I said, the myth is that public records means public access. But of course the PRA does allow for appropriate withholding of material where there are sensitivities in place. So the next step is to determine if there are any records that need to be restricted. And then record those access restrictions and make sure that you've got some policies and procedures in place that enable determinations to be made. In many ways, this could be seen as an extension of the OIA regime that you will have for your current material, recognising that some of those sensitivities which may lead you to want to withhold records will persist beyond 25 years. And issues around personal privacy are key ones. In our experience, typically commercial sensitivity and political sensitivity type issues will dissipate within this time frame, but clearly there are other reasons for restriction that will persist long after the 25-year threshold. So one of the key messages we want to leave you with is that it actually makes business sense to be thinking and implementing these provisions. So what are the drivers, what are the benefits for determining access? Well, clearly one of those major drivers is risk mitigation, prevention of unauthorised and uncontrolled access. If you don't know what's sensitive, you can't be confident that you're actually managing the access to that material. Business efficiency, knowing where it's appropriate just to give access freely and easily and where a more intensive process of consideration may need to be applied, so that you're not doing a detailed assessment where that's unnecessary. Consistency, consistent application of restrictions, so that you actually got a basis for making decisions in advance that's defensible and clear, and it's not just an ad hoc reaction to the circumstances of a particular record and a particular requester. And of course, clarity of guidance, so that your staff know what access conditions, you can be managing material appropriately, making sure that there are protections in place for the secure and sensitive material, that the right records are stored and managed in the right ways. These are provisions in the Act that I think it's fair to say are underused at the moment, and one of our ambitions through this forum and through the programs that we're talking about today is to try and increase the awareness of and use of these provisions, so that we're actually getting beyond that 41% of people that are actively classifying their legacy material. One of the second key myths that I'd like to touch on today is that records must be transferred to archives when they reach 25 years of age. No ifs, no buts, no maybes. Well, there is a presumption in the Act that records will be transferred by the time that they're 25 years. But this Act is deliberately constructed to provide a lot of flexibility. And around transfer, one of the key mechanisms for that is the opportunity to defer transfer. So the requirements to transfer does not apply if the administrative head and the chief archivist agree that the transfer can be deferred for a specified period. So, why might people want to do that? Well, in many cases, records that are 25 years of age may still be in use. Land records and patient files are two examples that we strike. Another set of examples are maybe records to do with key assets or infrastructure that has more than a 25-year life. 25 years is a pretty good default position for when material is likely to be past its current use and appropriate for archiving, but there will be many categories where that's not the case. The driver here is to make sure that you're actively thinking about whether these sorts of exemptions should apply for your records and doing something about that. We also note that agencies have records that are unable to be accessed. Over half of the agencies are reporting records that are unable to be accessed. So that accessibility of records, again, is something that needs to be thought about in terms of when transfers may need to be deferred. In terms of the advice for dealing with this provision and responding to it appropriately, again, that key first step, determine what records you hold that are over 25 years of age. I can't emphasise this enough. If you don't know what you've got, you can't be managing it appropriately. You can't be compliant with the Act. Or if you are, it's by chance rather than by dint of an appropriate management regime. The provisions here are in place because they make sense, they're underpinned by good guidance, but we need to know what the records are, the nature, the age, the basis, the origins of those records in order to apply the provisions meaningfully. So if you have got old records and it seems appropriate to maintain them within your agency, contact us. Talk about deferring transfer. Determine which records might be able to be appropriate for transfer to Archives New Zealand, make a plan there. And for the material that you're maintaining yourself, assess the storage conditions. Have you actually got adequate facilities to maintain those records? Remembering that that storage standard is mandatory for the storage conditions of older material. And ensuring that you've got processes in place to maintain the accessibility of records over time. One of our key concerns in agreeing to a deferral of transfer is, will the records survive if they're of importance? Will they continue to be accessible, understandable, available for future generations? Material is transferred to the archives regime in order to protect it and promote its accessibility. While it may be entirely appropriate to leave it in the custody of agencies, those same key considerations need to be in place, that the records will survive, be usable, be understandable for future users. So it's important to put in place that framework of decisions and important to document them. Again, I mentioned the public access register. There is a register similarly for deferrals of transfer, for transparency. So if material that would normally have come to archives because it's 25 years of age has been deferred, we have an obligation to record that so that researchers who front up at the Archives New Zealand site and want to look at material know that it's still being held by the agency, that's all authorised, it's all formalised, and how they can go about seeking it. The third area I'd like to touch on is this little myth. The Public Records Act means nothing can be destroyed, and one that we struck repeatedly in select committee and other discussions when the Act was being developed, this fear that nothing that's a public record can be destroyed. And that can lead to great accretions of old material that haven't ever really been actively considered, actively managed. In fact, the Public Records Act is as much about destroying stuff as it is about other processes. A colleague of mine in Australia used to say that his job was to find public records and destroy them. And I guess that's perhaps a summary of appraisal in some ways, finding the rubbish and destroying it. So the emphasis in the Public Records Act on disposal is as a process, that it is managed, it is systematic, it's regular. It's neutral. This is all the expectations that we have of that appraisal process, that evaluation of records. I think Tom's going to be talking a little bit more about appraisal as a key component of the response to dealing with legacy records. But this set of bullet points just gives you an indication of the sort of factors that you need to be considering when looking at the fate of older material, whether it should be kept, transferred, or perhaps managed within your own offices. And of course, on the basis of that, decisions do need to be taken. Good record keeping is not just about turning the handle and everything sort of flowing through. There are decisions to be taken. But those decisions should, as far as possible, be simple, be automated, be supporting business. You shouldn't be maintaining material that you don't have an interest in. Neither should government be paying, in general, for the maintenance of material where collectively there is no need for that to be maintained. There's a risk management approach that needs to be brought to all of this as well. We can all think of potential uses for information. Records are inherently records of something. Someone may be interested in them. But does the risk management perspective justify the investment in keeping them? So what we really argue for here is a combination of common sense and normal prudent business practice as being key principles in thinking about disposal. So are people actively appraising and disposing of records? Again, the message is increasingly yes. We have seen an increase in the number of agencies who've appraised their over 25-year-old records for transfer to Archives New Zealand, up to 31%, and an increase in the number of agencies who've appraised records and will subsequently destroy them, up to 29%. So it's very heartening to see that there is a an increase in activity around the application of the disposal provisions, that people are doing something about older material, trying to get authorities in place to determine the fate and manage records appropriately. But I think the other message that we can take from those numbers is that there's still quite a long way to go. There's still an awful lot of agencies who hold material where there hasn't been any formal authority yet put in place to determine whether records are of value or not. And again, I think one of the things that Tom will be covering in his presentation is how we propose to work with you all to try and get those numbers higher. What we can do to support you in better understanding what you've got, what value it has, so that those records can actually be managed appropriately. The benefits of doing that, I think, are pretty self-evident, but just a few that we've put on this slide. Reduced costs. There's an awfully large cost to records, to keeping them, whether it's retrieval, storage, or potential recovery if there's a disaster. All of those may not be necessary if the records could actually be authorised for disposal. Disposing of unnecessary or obsolete material, again, can enhance the efficient retrieval of information that is of value. And finally, as we saw with the other two sort of aspects that we talked about, you need to know what you have and what it's worth in order to really plan a strategy for managing records. The Public Records Act does set in place this threshold of 25 years as a somewhat arbitrary age at which records are considered to be likely to be more of historical archival value than of current business value. But it does provide quite a lot of flexibility around that threshold. The key thing to remember is that you can't actually just leave your records forever. You do need to do something about understanding them and managing them differently as they get older. Just because a record was worth creating doesn't mean it's worth keeping. Just because it needed to be restricted in access conditions when it was created doesn't mean that those sensitivities persist for all time. Records are dynamic things. They change their value, they change their significance over time. So it's important for all of us to make sure that we've got programs in place that understand that and that we're dealing with things not just because the Public Records Act has provisions that say at 25 years thou shalt do these things, but because it actually makes sense for each and every one of your agencies to be managing its information, its costs, its risks, by addressing the particular challenges of 25-year-old records. As I said, we recognise that that's a shared journey, and Tom will be talking about how we can help you do that. But at this point, I think it's time to see if there's any questions about the introduction that I've just provided. So, Amon. Yes.
Yeah, John.
Yeah.
A couple of points.
Yep.
One in relation to the 25 years transfer.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, in relation to most electronic records, 25 years is far too late.
Mm-hmm.
I think that should be something clear. So obviously, archives focus needs to be on the creation and maintenance of records a lot earlier on, because how many electronic records from 1983 and earlier still exist? I think the number would be extremely low. It would be a fraction of what actually was created. So to some extent, the Act isn't a very good guide in relation to management of electronic records and transfer at 25 years.
The Act provides quite a wide range of interventions to support good record keeping practice, and for different kinds of records the emphasis will be on different provisions. I think for the 25-year transfer provision is clearly more suited to relatively stable formats, paper and other media, whereas for electronic records the standard setting and other early interventions will be much more valuable in terms of ensuring that the records that are being created in volatile formats will survive over time and be useful as archives downstream. So it's very much a matter of ensuring that we're applying all the tools that the Public Records Act gives us appropriately for the different formats. Now, transfer to archives is still a relevant provision for electronic records, because there comes a point in time when agencies lose interest in active maintenance And unless there is an agency in place who is dedicated to that management and provision of access, that the risk becomes extremely high. So I think it's not that not that the transfer provisions are irrelevant, it's just that they're not sufficient, and they are, in this Act, supplemented by other mechanisms that enable us to make sure that records are managed through their whole life, whatever format they're in.
Okay, thanks, John. Just one point, really, and that relates to records over 25 years old. Yeah. Okay, no, I'll leave it at that.
Take it up offline if you want. No? Well, maybe you're also desperate to hear how we're going to help you that you're hanging out for Tom's presentation. Supplementary.
It's come back. It's come back, thank goodness. It's after lunch. Listen, obviously Archives is focusing on records over 25 years old, and that's fine. I'd just like to make the comment, it's obviously critical that departments are able to transfer those records at 25 years old, and that's taken into account when Archives prioritises transfers in its priority queue. So if there's an expectation on departments to transfer records, obviously, I mean, it's stating the obvious, but Archives needs to facilitate transfer of those records as a priority. Okay.
I think that's a fair observation. We don't want to be in the position of saying, you guys are non-compliant because you've done everything that you can, but we're not in a position to take them. That would just be completely inappropriate. We are putting more emphasis in our transfer planning on this sort of legacy material, recognising that there are particular statutory drivers for that transfer, and in conjunction with that, looking at how those deferral of transfer provisions may actually work to normalise situations where there is a lag, where records are identified and there's work to be done before transfer can occur. Maybe the records need to be better listed, appraisal still needs to happen. So there's looking to see how we can use mechanisms like the deferral of transfer to make sure that everyone sort of gets a clean bill of health while there is work happening to address the situation of records. Going once, going twice. Yes.
Just referring to that deferral of transfers and the listing process that you were talking about, if you've got legacy records over 25 years old and they've got listing but they're nowhere near Archives New Zealand requirements, but obviously getting them to that level of listing is not it's not just a little clerical job, it's a major undertaking. Would it be that feasible to have a deferred transfer that just applies on a substandard list?
So what, deferring the transfer while the listing is brought up to standard?
Yeah, well that's what I'm saying,
for example, yep.
Because actually getting that list up to speed, you may as well be going through the transfer process as far as I can see. But if you've got a list that may not be that good, but you've got it, and then surely it's better that Archives New Zealand or the general public are aware of those records, and there may be some provision in the listing that says the listing is not of sufficient standard.
Tom's just telling me that he's covering this in terms of the sorts of steps that we would envisage around authorising disposal of the stuff that can be destroyed, what we would envisage around helping agencies get the lists up to scratch and those processes as part of our broader response. Because certainly these are not unusual scenarios where people have got sort of a generic level control but nothing that's up to the standards required for transfer. And it is part of understanding what processes have been carried out in terms of control, appraisal, access consideration, which ones haven't, and how we sequence the remaining pieces. whilst minimising the burden on agencies.
Okay, thank you.
I'll hand back to Natalie to introduce Tom. Thank you.